The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Lucy Collins wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her sleeve. 3 days had passed since their wagon wheel cracked beyond repair, leaving her and her 2 young children stranded 20 miles from the nearest town. The broken pieces of wood lay scattered where they had fallen, a cruel reminder of how quickly life could change. Lucy's stomach cramped with hunger as she looked back at her makeshift camp behind a cluster of weathered rocks. Her 6-year-old son Billy was trying to comfort his little sister Annie, who had stopped crying hours ago, not because she felt better, but because she was too weak to continue. The sight of her children's pale faces and sunken eyes made Lucy's heart ache in ways she never knew possible. Just 2 months ago, life had been different. Her husband Robert had been alive then, working their small farm outside Tucson. They weren't rich, but they had enough food on the table and a roof over their heads. Then the fever came. It started with Robert complaining about feeling tired after working in the fields. Within a week, he was burning up with temperature, and within 2 weeks, he was gone. The doctor's bills came first, followed by demands from the bank. Lucy discovered that Robert had borrowed money against their farm to buy better farming equipment, hoping to increase their harvest. Without him to work the land, there was no way to pay back what they owed. The bank took everything: the house, the farm, even most of their belongings. Lucy had packed what little remained into their old wagon and decided to head west toward California, where her sister lived. Her sister had written promising work and a place to stay, but that letter felt like a lifetime ago now. The journey that should have taken 2 weeks had turned into a nightmare when their wagon wheel split right down the middle. While crossing a rocky stretch of trail for the first day after the breakdown, Lucy had hoped another traveler would come along to help. She rationed their small supply of water and the last of their hardtack biscuits, telling the children that help would come soon. On the second day, she started walking back toward the last town they had passed, but with 2 small children, progress was painfully slow. They made it only a few miles before Annie collapsed from exhaustion. Now, on the 3rd day, Lucy faced a terrible reality. They were going to die out here if something didn't change soon. The water was almost gone, the food was completely finished, and the children were getting weaker by the hour. Billy had stopped asking when they would eat again, and Annie barely opened her eyes when Lucy spoke to her. That's when Lucy heard it. The creaking of wooden wheels and the steady clip-clop of horse hooves approaching from the east. Her heart jumped with hope as she scrambled to the edge of the rocks to get a better look. Coming down the trail was a sturdy supply wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. The wagon looked well-maintained and heavily loaded with goods covered by a thick canvas tarp. Driving the wagon was a man who appeared to be in his 30s, wearing a dark hat and simple work clothes. He sat straight and alert, clearly comfortable handling the reins. Most importantly, he was alone. Lucy's mind began racing as she watched the wagon approach. Here was someone who obviously had supplies, food, water, maybe even tools that could help fix their broken wheel. Lucy called out and waved her arms, hoping the stranger would stop to help. But as she did, a darker thought crept into her mind. What if he didn't want to help? What if he was the type of person who would look at a desperate woman and her starving children and simply ride on by? She had heard stories of travelers who refused to share even a cup of water with those in need. She looked back at her children again. Billy was holding Annie in his thin arms, both of them looking like little ghosts of their former selves. The sight filled Lucy with a fierce determination she had never felt before. These were her babies, and she would do whatever it took to keep them alive. Lucy's hand moved to the old pistol tucked into her belt, Robert's gun that she had grabbed when leaving the farm. She had never fired it, barely knew how to use it. But the weight of it against her hip had given her some comfort during their journey. Now, as she watched the approaching wagon, that weight felt different. It felt like possibility. The idea came to her suddenly and hit her like a physical blow. She could take what her children needed from this stranger. It would be wrong, terribly wrong, but what choice did she have? Let her children die while someone else rode by with wagon full of supplies? The thought of it made her feel sick, but The thought of watching Annie and Billy waste away made her feel even sicker. Lucy had been raised to be honest and God-fearing. Her parents had taught her that stealing was a sin, and she had lived her whole life believing that good people found good ways to solve their problems. But sitting in the desert heat, watching her children slowly dying before her eyes, those lessons felt like luxuries she could no longer afford. She pulled the pistol from her belt and checked to make sure it was loaded. Her hands shook as she examined the weapon, partly from nervousness and partly from hunger. The gun felt heavier than she remembered, and for a moment she wondered if she would even be able to hold it steady enough to be convincing. The wagon was getting closer now. Lucy could see the driver's face more clearly. He looked like a decent man, probably someone with a family of his own somewhere. That made what she was about to do feel even worse, but it also made her more determined. If this man had a family, then he would understand why she had to do this. Lucy positioned herself behind the largest rock where she could step out and block the trail. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought the driver might hear it from 50 yards away. She practiced, pointing the gun, trying to make her hands stop shaking. She had to appear confident and dangerous. Even though she felt neither. As the wagon drew closer, Lucy could hear the driver humming quietly to himself. The sound made her stomach turn with guilt, but she pushed the feeling away. This wasn't about being good or bad anymore. This was about survival. This was about making sure her children lived to see another sunrise. The moment had come. Lucy took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the rocks, and raised the pistol. Her voice cracked as she called out for the wagon to stop, but she forced herself to sound as threatening as possible. Inside, she was praying that this stranger would have mercy on a desperate mother, even if that mercy had to be forced from him at gunpoint. What she didn't know was that this particular stranger had been looking for her family for weeks, and that the supplies in his wagon were already meant for her children. But that revelation was still to come, and for now, Lucy stood in the middle of the dusty trail with a gun in her shaking hands, about to change both their lives forever. The wagon rolled to a gentle stop about 10 feet away from where Lucy stood with the pistol raised. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to keep the heavy gun steady in her trembling hands. The horses snorted and shifted, sensing the tension in the air, but they remained calm under their driver's steady control. What happened next caught Lucy completely off guard. Instead of throwing his hands up in fear or reaching for a weapon of his own, the man simply sat there studying her face with a curious expression. His dark eyes moved from her torn and dusty dress to her sunburned cheeks, then to the way her whole body was shaking. He didn't look scared. He didn't even look particularly surprised. "Ma'am," he said in a voice so calm it made Lucy wonder if she was holding the gun wrong. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." Lucy blinked hard, not expecting conversation. She had imagined this moment going very differently. In her mind, she would demand his supplies, he would hand them over in fear, and she would take what her children needed and disappear. She hadn't planned on him actually talking to her like a human being. "I said stop the wagon," she repeated, trying to make her voice sound more threatening. But even to her own ears, she sounded more like a woman on the verge of tears than a dangerous highway robber. The man slowly wrapped the reins around the wagon brake and leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I stopped," he said simply. "But before we go any further, can I ask you something? Are you sure this is what you want to do?" The question hit Lucy like a slap. Of course, this wasn't what she wanted to do. She wanted to be back on her farm with Robert, watching their children play in the yard while dinner cooked on the stove. She wanted to have never heard the word foreclosure or felt the hollow ache of hunger in her belly. She wanted a lot of things, but wanting and having were two very different matters. "Just hand over your supplies," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. To her horror, she felt tears starting to blur her vision. This was supposed to be simple. Point the gun, make demands, save her children. She hadn't expected kindness to make it so much harder. The stranger tilted his head slightly, and Lucy could see him taking in more details about her appearance. His gaze lingered on the torn sleeve of her dress where she had caught it on a thorny bush 2 days ago. He noticed the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, and how her lips were cracked from dehydration. "Those your children back there behind." "The rocks?" he asked, nodding toward where Billy and Annie were hidden. Lucy's breath caught. How had he known? She glanced quickly over her shoulder, then back at him, tightening her grip on the pistol. "That's none of your business." "I think it is my business," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a hint of something stronger. Not anger, exactly, but determination. "Because if there are children involved, then we need to handle this differently." Lucy felt panic rising in her chest. Was he threatening her children? Was he the kind of man who would hurt little ones to get what he wanted? She raised the gun higher, pointing it directly at his chest. "Don't you dare touch them?" To her amazement, the man actually smiled a little at that. "Ma'am, I wouldn't dream of hurting children. But I am wondering how long it's been since they've had a proper meal." The question broke something inside Lucy. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over, running down her cheeks and leaving clean tracks through the dust on her face. 3 days, she whispered. "They haven't eaten in 3 days." The man's expression grew serious. He looked from Lucy to the direction of the hidden children, then back to her face. "And you? When did you last eat?" "I gave them the last of our food on the first day," Lucy admitted, then immediately wondered why she was telling this stranger anything. She was supposed to be robbing him. Not having a conversation about their situation, something shifted in the man's posture. He sat up straighter and began to slowly climb down from the wagon seat. "Ma'am, I'm going to reach into the back of my wagon now. I want you to know that I'm not reaching for a weapon." Lucy watched nervously as he moved to the back of the wagon and began untying the canvas cover. "What are you doing?" "What needs to be done," he replied. He pulled back the canvas to reveal the wagon bed packed with supplies. Lucy could see sacks of flour and beans, strips of dried meat hanging from hooks, and even some canned goods packed carefully in wooden crates. The sight of all that food made Lucy's knees weak. Her mouth watered so suddenly it was painful, and she had to fight the urge to lower the gun and simply beg. This man had more food in his wagon than her family had seen in months. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, confused. "Because," he said, reaching into the wagon and pulling out a cloth bundle, "I think we can solve your problem without anyone getting hurt." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal fresh bread, the kind that was still soft and smelled like heaven. When was the last time those children had fresh bread? Lucy couldn't remember. Before Robert died, certainly. Maybe before he got sick. The smell of it made her stomach cramp with hunger so intense it was almost painful. "I don't understand what you're doing." The man walked slowly toward her, holding the bread where she could see it. "I'm trying to help. But I need you to put that gun down first." "No," Lucy said quickly. "No, this isn't how this works. You're supposed to be scared. You're supposed to give me what I want and let me go." "And what do you want?" he asked, stopping a few feet away from her. "Food, water, maybe some supplies to fix our wagon wheel." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Then why are we standing here with a gun between us when I can give you all of those things?" he asked. "Why don't you tell me what happened to your family, and let me see if I can help properly?" Lucy stared at him in complete bewilderment. "You're not making any sense. People don't just give away their supplies to strangers, especially not to strangers who try to rob them." "Some people do," he said quietly, "especially when those strangers are desperate mothers trying to keep their children alive." The simple acceptance in his voice nearly undid Lucy completely. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with such understanding? When was the last time someone had looked at her situation and offered help instead of judgment or indifference? "I don't have any money to pay you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did I ask for money?" "Then why would you help me?" The man was quiet for a long moment, looking past her toward where the children were hidden. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose family, and I know what it's like to wish you could have done more to help them." Something in his tone made Lucy lower the gun slightly. There was pain in his voice, old and deep, the kind that came from carrying guilt. "For a long time?" "You lost someone?" "My brother," he said simply. And his family, I should have been there to help them, but I wasn't. Maybe helping you is my chance to make up for that. Lucy felt the last of her resolve crumbling. This stranger was offering exactly what she had been prepared to steal, and he was doing it out of kindness. It felt too good to be true, which made her suspicious all over again. "What's the catch?" she asked. "Nobody helps strangers for nothing. No catch," he said. "Just let me help your children. That's all I want." Lucy looked into his eyes, searching for deception or hidden motives. All she saw was sincerity and something that looked like determination, against every instinct that told her to be careful. To protect herself and her children from potential danger, Lucy found herself beginning to believe that this stranger might actually be telling the truth. Lucy watched in complete amazement as the stranger walked back to his wagon and began pulling out supplies without her even having to threaten him again. The gun felt heavy and useless in her hands as he calmly untied rope and moved canvas aside, like he was simply unpacking for a planned stop. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she could clearly see what he was doing. "It just didn't make any sense." "Getting food for your children," he replied, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He pulled out a large cloth sack and began filling it with items from his wagon. First went the fresh bread she had smelled, then strips of dried beef that looked better than anything her family had eaten in months. Lucy kept the gun pointed in his general direction, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. This wasn't how robberies were supposed to work. The victim wasn't supposed to help the robber pack up stolen goods. "You're making this very confusing," she said. The man looked up from his packing and actually chuckled. "I imagine I am. Here, catch." He tossed a water canteen in her direction. Lucy caught it with her free hand, nearly dropping the gun in the process. The canteen was full and cool to the touch. Without thinking, she uncapped it and took a long drink. The water was clean and fresh, better than anything they had tasted since leaving their last camp. She wanted to drain the whole thing, but forced herself to save most of it for Billy and Annie. "Better?" the stranger asked, continuing to pack the cloth sack. "Why are you doing this?" Lucy asked again. She couldn't understand it. In her experience, people only helped when they got something in return. Even the church folks back home had expected attendance and proper behavior in exchange for their charity. "Because you need help," he said simply. He pulled out a small wooden toy horse carved with careful detail. "This might be good for the little ones." Lucy stared at the toy. "You have children's toys in your wagon?" "A few things." He added the toy horse to the sack, then pulled out a small cornhusk doll with a painted face. "Sometimes children need more than just food." The sight of the toys made Lucy's chest tight with emotion. When was the last time Billy and Annie had anything new to play with? When was the last time they had smiled? She had been so focused on keeping them alive that she had forgotten children needed joy too. "I should get these to them," she said, looking toward the rocks where her children were hidden. But she hesitated. Walking away meant trusting this stranger not to drive off with his wagon while she was gone. It also meant admitting that she was no longer trying to rob him. "Go ahead," the man said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll be right here when you get back." Lucy looked at him suspiciously. "How do I know you won't leave?" "Because I said I wouldn't." He sat down on a nearby rock and pulled his hat down to shade his eyes. "Besides, we're not finished talking yet." Something in his tone made Lucy curious. But Billy and Annie needed food more than she needed answers. She tucked the gun into her belt and picked up the sack of supplies. It was heavier than she expected, packed with more food than she had dared to hope for. Walking back to their makeshift camp, Lucy felt like she was living in a dream. An hour ago, she had been a desperate woman preparing to commit a crime. Now, she was carrying more food than her family had seen in weeks. Given freely by a stranger who seemed to expect nothing in return, Billy looked up when she approached, his thin face brightening with hope. "Mama, did someone come to help us?" "Yes, sweetheart." Lucy knelt down and opened the sack. "Look what we have." Annie stirred weakly when she smelled the bread. Her eyes opened wide when she saw the food, and for the first time in days, she sat up on her own. "Is it real food, Mama?" "It's real." Lucy tore off pieces of the soft bread and handed them to both children. She watched them eat, forcing herself not to cry as they devoured the food with desperate hunger. The bread disappeared quickly, but she had plenty more in the sack. "Slow down, babies," she said gently. "There's more where that came from. We don't want you getting sick from eating too fast." Billy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Where did it come from, Mama? Did you buy it?" Lucy hesitated. How could she explain to a 6-year-old that she had tried to steal food, but the man had given it to her instead? "Our kind man gave it to us? He's waiting out by the road? Can we meet him?" Annie asked, already looking stronger after just a few bites of food? "Maybe," Lucy said. "Let me talk to him first." She gave them each a piece of the dried beef and the water canteen, watching as color returned to their pale cheeks. The transformation was remarkable. Just minutes of proper food and water were already making them look more like the healthy children they had been before this nightmare began. "I need to go talk to the man who gave us this food," Lucy told them. "Stay here and eat slowly. I'll be back soon." Walking back toward the road, Lucy tried to make sense of what was happening. The stranger was still sitting exactly where she had left him, apparently in no hurry to leave. His wagon and horses waited patiently in the afternoon heat. "Your children. Feeling better?" he asked when she approached. "Much better, thanks to you." Lucy sat down on a rock across from him, suddenly feeling exhausted. The stress of the last few days was catching up with her now that the immediate crisis was over. "I don't understand why you're helping us. Maybe I should explain that." The man leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "But first, why don't you tell me what happened to your family? How did you end up stranded out here?" Lucy found herself talking before she really decided to. Maybe it was relief, or maybe it was gratitude, but the words poured out of her. She told him about Robert's death, about losing the farm, about their hopes of reaching California, and her sister's promise of work. She explained about the broken wagon wheel and their 3 days of hunger and desperation. The stranger listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, but mostly just letting her talk. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your husband," he said finally. "What was his full name?" Lucy thought it was an odd question, but answered anyway. "Robert Collins. He grew up around Tucson before we met." Something changed in the stranger's expression. His eyes sharpened with interest, and he sat up straighter. "Robert Collins from the farm outside Tucson?" Tall man, brown hair, had a scar on his hand from a farming accident when he was young. Lucy's heart skipped. "You knew my husband?" "I knew him." The man was quiet for another moment, seeming to wrestle with something. "Mrs. Collins, there's something I need to tell you. Something important about why I was carrying all these supplies, and why I've been traveling this particular road." "What do you mean?" The stranger reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something Lucy couldn't quite see. "Before I explain, I need you to know that everything I've given you today, and everything I'm about to give you, was already meant for your family." Lucy stared at him in confusion. "What are you talking about? We've never met before." "No, we haven't met. But I've been looking for you and your children for quite some time." He held out what he had pulled from his pocket. "Mrs. Collins, you might want to take a look at this." Lucy reached out and took the object from his hand. It was a worn piece of paper, folded and refolded many times. She unfolded it carefully and found herself looking at a letter written in familiar handwriting. Her own handwriting. It was the letter she had written to her sister in California, the one she had posted from town just before Robert got sick. The letter where she had mentioned their financial troubles and asked if there might be work available out west. But how had this stranger gotten hold of it? "I don't understand," she said, looking up at him with growing alarm. "How do you have my letter?" The man took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "Because your sister gave it to me, Mrs. Collins. She asked me to find you and bring you safely to California. She's been worried sick since she heard about Robert's death." Lucy felt like the world was spinning. "My sister sent you? But how did she even know about Robert?" "I never told her he died. Someone did," the man said quietly. Someone who cared enough about your family to make sure word reached the people who love you. The pieces of a puzzle Lucy didn't even know existed were starting to come together, but the picture they formed didn't make sense yet. "Who are you?" she asked. "And how do you know so much about my family?" Lucy stared at the letter in her hands, reading her own words written months ago when life had been difficult but not impossible. The paper felt strange and foreign now, like a message from a different person who had lived a different life. She looked up at the stranger, her mind racing with questions that didn't have easy answers. "You still haven't told me who you are," she said, folding the letter carefully. "My sister wouldn't just send a stranger to look for us. She's not the trusting type." The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected this question but wasn't quite ready to answer it. He stood up and walked a few steps away, looking out across the desert landscape. When he turned back to face her, Lucy could see something heavy in his expression, like he was carrying a burden he had been holding for a long time. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly, "before I tell you who I am, I need to ask you something. Did your husband ever talk about his family? About where he came from before you met him?" Lucy thought back to the early days of their marriage. Robert had always been quiet about his past, and she had learned not to push him on subjects that made him uncomfortable. He said his parents died when he was young. He mentioned having a brother once, but they had some kind of falling out years ago. He never wanted to talk about it. The stranger's expression grew even more serious. "What did he tell you about this brother?" "Not much." Lucy tried to remember the few times Robert had mentioned family. He said his brother was older and stubborn, that they disagreed about something important, and his brother chose a different path. Robert said he hadn't spoken to him in years and probably never would again. The man was quiet for a long moment, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Mrs. Collins, that brother your husband mentioned? The one he had a falling out with?" Lucy felt her heart start to beat faster. Something in his tone told her that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "What about him?" Instead of answering directly, the stranger reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From inside the wallet, he took out a small, faded photograph and handed it to Lucy. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Lucy took the photograph with trembling fingers. It was old and cracked, the kind taken by traveling photographers who visited small towns. The picture showed two boys, maybe 10 and 12 years old, standing side by side in their best clothes. The younger boy looked exactly like Robert had. As a child, she had seen similar pictures of him that his aunt had kept, but it was the older boy that made Lucy's breath catch in her throat. Even as a child, his face had the same strong features, the same steady eyes as the man standing in front of her now. "This is you?" she whispered, looking up at him. "And this is Robert. My name is David Collins," he said quietly. "And Robert was my younger brother." The words hit Lucy like a physical blow. She sank down onto the rock behind her, still holding the photograph. "You're Robert's brother? The one he had the fight with?" David nodded, his expression filled with pain and regret. "We had a terrible argument 15 years ago. I wanted to become a sheriff, to work in law enforcement. Robert thought I was abandoning our family land, abandoning everything our parents had worked for. He wanted me to stay and farm with him." Lucy stared at him in shock. "You're a sheriff?" "I am." David reached into his vest again and pulled out a worn badge. "Sheriff David Collins of Maricopa County. The same job that cost me my relationship with my brother?" The badge gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. Lucy looked from it to David's face, trying to process what this meant. She had tried to rob a sheriff. She had pointed a gun at a lawman and demanded his supplies. But more than that, she had tried to rob her own brother-in-law. "Robert never told me he had a brother who was a sheriff," she said weakly. "I'm not surprised. We both said things that day that we could never take back. I told him he was too scared to leave the farm and see the world. He told me I was selfish and cared more about wearing a badge than about family." David's voice was heavy with old pain. "We were both young and angry and too proud to admit when we were wrong." Lucy thought about all the times Robert had seemed sad when she mentioned family, All the times he had looked wistful when he saw brothers working together in town. "He missed you," she said quietly. "I could tell." He never said it directly, but I could see it in his face sometimes. David's composure cracked slightly at that. I missed him too, more than I can say. I kept telling myself I would reach out to him someday, when enough time had passed and we had both cooled down. But years kept going by, and it got harder and harder to make the first move. So what changed? Why are you here now? Because I finally heard what happened to him. David sat down heavily on a nearby rock. A friend of mine, another sheriff, was passing through Tucson on business. He heard about Robert's death and recognized the name. When he told me, I realized I had waited too long. I would never get the chance to apologize or make things right. Lucy felt tears starting to form. In her eyes, he would have forgiven you. Robert wasn't the type to hold grudges forever. Maybe, but I'll never know for sure, will I? David looked out across the desert. All I could do was try to help the family he left behind. So I tracked down your sister's address and went to see her. She showed me your letter, told me how worried she was about you and the children. That's why you have all these supplies. Everything in that wagon is meant for you and your children. Food, tools to fix your wagon, clothes, toys for Billy and Annie, money to help you get started in California. Your sister and I planned it all out. Lucy felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what David was telling her. You've been looking for this whole time? For 3 weeks. I followed your trail from Tucson, asking at every town and trading post. I was starting to worry I might never find you. David looked at her with something that might have been relief. When I saw that broken wagon wheel back there on the trail, I knew I was getting close. You saw our wagon? I buried it properly and said a prayer. I figured you and the children had either been picked up by someone or were walking ahead on the trail. David shook his head. I never imagined you would try to rob me. The absurdity of the situation suddenly hit Lucy. She started to laugh, though it came out sounding half hysterical. I tried to steal supplies that were already meant for my children. From their own uncle? You didn't know, David said gently. You were protecting your family the only way you knew how. There's no shame in that. Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Robert would have found this funny, I think. Me pointing a gun at his big brother without knowing who he was. He probably would have, David smiled sadly. He always did. Like irony. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of Robert and the strange way fate had brought them together. Finally, Lucy looked up at David with a question that had been nagging at her. When you first saw me with the gun, you didn't seem surprised. You acted like you were expecting something like that to happen. David considered this. I wasn't expecting you to rob me, exactly. But I was looking for a desperate woman with 2 young children who had been traveling alone for weeks. I figured if I found you, you might not trust a stranger right away, even one trying to help. So you were ready for me to be suspicious. I was ready for you to do whatever you needed to do to protect Billy and Annie, including pointing a gun at me if that's what it took. David stood up and brushed dust off his pants. What I wasn't ready for was how much you would remind me of Robert. You have the same determination, the same fierce love for family? Lucy felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. He was a good man, and he chose a good woman to share his life with. David looked toward the rocks where the children were hidden. Those kids are lucky to have you as their mother. They're lucky to have you as their uncle too, even. If they don't know it yet? David's expression grew uncertain. About that, I don't want to presume anything. I know I'm a stranger to you and the children. I don't expect to just step into Robert's place or anything like that. Lucy stood up as well, still holding the old photograph of 2 boys who had grown apart but were now being brought back together. By tragedy and chance? Maybe we should start by letting them meet their Uncle David, she said. I think they'd like to know they have family who cares about them. I'd like that very much, David said quietly. I'd like that more than anything. Walking back toward the rocks where Billy and Annie were waiting, Lucy felt like she was floating in a dream. Everything had changed in the span of an hour. This morning she had been a desperate widow with no family except her distant sister. Now she was walking beside her children's uncle, a man who had been searching for them for weeks with a wagon full of supplies and hope. David walked quietly beside her, and she could sense his nervousness. Meeting the children of a brother he had lost touch with years ago couldn't be easy for him. Lucy wondered what he was thinking, what he was hoping for from this first meeting with Billy and Annie. "Are you sure about this?" David asked as they approached the rocks. "I don't want to overwhelm them. They've been through enough already." Lucy appreciated his concern. "They need to know they have family who cares about them. They need to know they're not alone in the world." As they rounded the rocks, Lucy saw that Billy and Annie had made remarkable progress. The food and water had brought color back to their cheeks, and they were sitting up properly for the first time in days. Billy was carefully sharing pieces of dried meat with his little sister, making sure she got her fair portion. "Mama," Annie called out when she saw Lucy approaching. "The food is so good, and there's so much of it." "I'm glad you're feeling better, sweetheart." Lucy knelt down beside her children. "There's someone I want you to meet. This is the kind man who gave us all this food." David stood a few feet back, clearly unsure of how to approach. Lucy could see emotion flickering across his face as he looked at the children. Billy had Robert's nose and chin, while Annie had inherited the same dark eyes that both Robert and David shared. "Hello," Billy said politely, the way his parents had taught him to greet adults. "Thank you for the food, mister. We were really hungry." "You're very welcome," David replied, his voice gentler than Lucy had heard it before. "I'm glad I could help." Annie tilted her head to study David's face with the curious intensity that only small children possessed. "You look like my papa," she said suddenly. "Your eyes are the same color as his were." The simple observation hit David like a physical blow. Lucy saw him swallow hard before answering. "That's because your papa was my brother," he said quietly. Billy's eyes widened. "You're our uncle?" "I am." David moved closer, crouching down to be at their eye level. "Your father and I hadn't seen each other in a long time, but I loved him very much. And I've been looking for you and your mama because I wanted to help take care of you." "Papa said he had a brother," Billy said thoughtfully. "But he said they had a fight and couldn't be friends anymore." "We did have a fight," David admitted. "A very silly fight about things that don't matter anymore. I wish we had made up before he died, but we didn't get the chance. So now I want to make sure his family is safe and happy." Annie stood up and walked over to David, studying his face from up close. "Are you going to take care of us now?" The question was so innocent and trusting that it brought tears to Lucy's eyes. Children had a way of cutting through all the complicated adult emotions and getting straight to what mattered most. "If your mama says it's okay, I'd like to help take care of you," David said. "Would you like that?" Annie nodded seriously. "Yes, Mama's been very sad since Papa died. Maybe having an uncle will make her happy again." Billy came over to join his sister. "Do you have children of your own, Uncle David?" "No, I don't. It's just me." "Then we can be your children," Billy declared with the matter-of-fact confidence. "Of a 6-year-old, and you can be our new papa?" Lucy saw David's eyes fill with tears at the innocent offer. "I would be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I could never replace your real papa. I'll just be your Uncle David who loves you very much." "That's okay," Annie said, reaching out to pat David's cheek with her small hand. "We have room for lots of love." The simple gesture broke down whatever walls David had been keeping around his heart. He gently pulled both children into a hug, and Lucy could see his shoulders shaking slightly as he held them close. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when your papa died," he whispered to them. "I'm sorry I didn't know you needed help sooner. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Lucy wiped her own tears as she watched her children embrace the uncle they had just met. It felt right in a way that surprised her. These three people belonged together, connected by blood and loss and love. "Uncle David," Billy said, pulling back from the hug, "do you know how to fix wagon wheels?" David laughed, a sound that was half joy and half tears. "I do know how to fix wagon wheels. In fact, I brought all the tools and wood we need to get." Your wagon rolling again? Really? Annie clapped her hands together. So we don't have to walk anymore? No more walking, David promised. We'll fix your wagon, and then we'll all travel together to California to see your Aunt Margaret. Aunt Margaret? Billy exclaimed. Mama said she has a big house and a garden. She does, David confirmed, and she's been very worried about you. She can't wait to meet you both. Lucy felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For months, she had been the only adult responsible for keeping her children safe and fed. The burden of being their sole protector had been crushing, especially after Robert died. Now, suddenly, she wasn't alone anymore. There's something else, David said, looking at Lucy over the children's heads. I brought more than just food and wagon repair supplies. Your sister sent clothes and toys, and I added some things of my own. What kind of things? Annie asked, bouncing with excitement. Well, let's see. There are books for learning to read and a set of wooden blocks for building and... David paused dramatically, a harmonica for making music. Both children gasped with delight. Billy had been asking for a harmonica for his birthday, but money had been too tight for such luxuries. Can we see them now? Billy asked eagerly. After we get some more food in you and fix that wagon, David said. We have plenty of time to look at everything together. Lucy watched the easy way David talked to her children, how naturally he seemed, to understand what they needed to hear. He wasn't trying too hard or making promises he couldn't keep. He was just being present and kind, letting them set the pace for building their relationship. I can't believe this is real, Lucy said quietly to David while the children discussed all the things they wanted to do with their new uncle. It's real, David assured her. And Lucy, I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you except the chance to be part of this family. I know you're still grieving Robert, and I know trusting someone new isn't easy. Lucy looked at her children, who were already making plans with their uncle, and then at David, who was watching them with such obvious love and protectiveness. Robert would be happy, she said finally. He would be happy that his children have their uncle to look after them. Do you think he would forgive me for staying away so long? Lucy thought about her husband, about his capacity for forgiveness and his deep love for family. He already has, she said with certainty. I think this was always meant to happen. Maybe not the way it did, but somehow we were supposed to find each other. David nodded, looking out toward his wagon loaded with supplies and hope. Then let's go fix that wagon wheel and start the next part of our journey together. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky as the four of them made their way back to where Lucy's broken wagon sat abandoned on the trail. Billy and Annie walked between Lucy and David, chattering excitedly about all the things they had discovered in their uncle's supplies. The children seemed to have endless energy now that they had proper food in their stomachs and hope in their hearts. Lucy found herself stealing glances at David as they walked. It was strange how quickly everything had changed between them. Hour ago, she had been pointing a gun at him. Now she was trusting him with her children's lives and their future. But somehow it felt right. Maybe it was the way he listened when Billy told him about their old farm, or how he patiently answered Annie's questions about what sheriffs did all day. When they reached the broken wagon, Lucy felt a familiar stab of sadness. The damaged wheel lay in pieces where it had fallen, surrounded by the scattered remains of their old life. A few clothes that had fallen out when the wheel broke, some pots and pans that weren't worth much but had been wedding gifts from Robert's. Aunt, this brings back memories, David said quietly, running his hand along the wagon's side. Robert built this himself, didn't he? How did you know? Lucy asked. He always was good with his hands. Even as a boy, he could fix anything that broke around the farm? David knelt down to examine the broken wheel. This is good craftsmanship. The wheel just got old and couldn't handle the rough ground anymore. Billy came over to stand beside David. Papa made this wagon for us before I was born. He said it would take us anywhere we wanted to go. Your papa was right, David said. And we're going to fix it so it can take you all the way to California, just like he planned. David went back to his own wagon and returned with a toolbox and several pieces of seasoned wood. Lucy watched as he laid out the tools with practiced efficiency. You really do know how to fix wagon wheels. I've fixed more than my share over the years. Being a sheriff means helping folks with all kinds of problems, not just catching criminals. David selected a piece of wood and held it up to measure against the broken wheel. This should work perfectly. As David began working on the wheel, Lucy found herself studying his face. Now that she knew to look for it, she could see the resemblance to Robert. They had the same strong jaw, the same way of concentrating when they were working with their hands. But there were differences too. David's face showed the wear of a man who had seen difficult things, who carried responsibilities that weighed on him. Can I help? Billy asked, clearly fascinated by the repair work. Of course. David handed him a small piece of sandpaper. Your job is to smooth out these rough spots on the wood. Can you do that? Billy nodded eagerly and set to work. Annie wandered over to examine the supplies in David's wagon, marveling at all the wonderful things packed inside. Lucy, David said quietly while the children were busy, there's something else we need to talk about. Something about what happened earlier when you tried to rob me. Lucy felt her stomach tighten. She had been dreading this conversation. I know what you're going to say. I pointed a gun at a sheriff. That's a serious crime. It is, David agreed, continuing to work on the wheel. But I'm not planning to arrest you or file any charges. Why not? You should. I would deserve it. David stopped working and looked at her directly. Because you're family. Because you were protecting your children. And because technically you didn't actually steal anything. But I tried to. Did you? Or did you ask for help in the only way you knew how? David's voice was gentle but serious. Lucy, I've been a sheriff for 15 years. I know the difference between a criminal and a desperate parent. You're not a bad person who happened to have children. You're a good person who was put in an impossible situation. Lucy felt tears threatening again. I've never done anything like that before in my life. I was raised to be honest, to work for what I needed. But when I saw Billy and Annie getting weaker every day, you did what any parent would do. You found a way to save your children. David resumed his work on the wheel. There's no shame in that. But what if you hadn't been who you are? What if you had been just a regular traveler with a family of your own? I might have taken food from someone else's children. David considered this. But I wasn't just a regular traveler. And those supplies weren't meant for my family. They were meant for yours. Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to, even when we can't see it at the time. Lucy watched Billy carefully sanding the wood, his small face serious with concentration. I keep thinking about what might have happened if I had actually shot you. If something had gone wrong But it didn't go wrong, David interrupted. Firmly, and you never would have shot me. I could see it in your eyes from the beginning. You were scared and desperate, but you weren't dangerous. How could you tell? Because your hands were shaking so badly you could barely hold the gun. Steady, because you were more worried about your children than you were about threatening me. And because when I started giving you supplies, you looked guilty, not triumphant, David smiled slightly. Real criminals don't feel guilty about taking what they want. Lucy had to admit he was right. From the moment David had started helping her, she had felt terrible about trying to rob him. I'm still ashamed of it. Don't be. Be proud that you were willing to do whatever it took to keep your children alive. That's what good mothers do. Annie came skipping back from the wagon with something cupped in her hands. Uncle David, what's this? She opened her palms to reveal a small carved wooden bird, painted in bright blues and reds. That's a special toy that a friend of mine made, David said. He's a Navajo craftsman who lives near my town. He carved it for children who might need something beautiful to hold on to during difficult times. It's the prettiest thing I've ever seen, Annie breathed, cradling the bird carefully. Then it's yours to keep, David said. Your friend carved it hoping it would make some little girl smile, and I think he'd be very happy to know it found. It's way to you, Billy looked up from his sanding work. Uncle David, do you have friends who are Indians? I do. Some of my best friends are Navajo and Apache. They've taught me a lot about taking care of the land and helping each other through hard times. Papa said some people don't like Indians, Billy said thoughtfully. Some people are afraid of anyone who's different from them, David explained. But I've learned that people are pretty much the same everywhere. We all want to keep our families safe and have enough food to eat and a place to call home. Lucy listened to this conversation with interest. Robert had been more traditional in his views about native peoples, influenced by the opinions of other farmers in their area. It was refreshing to hear David talk about friendship and understanding, instead of fear and suspicion. "The wheel's almost finished," David announced, fitting the last piece of wood into place. "Billy, you did excellent work with that sanding. This wheel is going to be stronger than the original." "Really?" Billy beamed with pride. "Really, your papa would be proud of the good helper you are." As David put the finishing touches on the repair work, Lucy found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. This morning she had been alone and desperate. Now she was part of a family again, with a brother-in-law who cared about her children and a future that looked brighter than anything she had dared to hope for. "David," she said quietly, "when we get to California, what happens then? I mean, you have your job as sheriff back in Arizona. You can't just abandon that to help us get settled." David was quiet for a moment, testing the strength of the repaired wheel. "I've been thinking about that. I have some vacation time saved up, and the deputy can handle things for a few weeks. I figured I'd stay long enough to make sure you and the children are settled and comfortable. And then we'll figure out what comes next. Maybe I'll visit regularly. Maybe you'll come visit me sometimes. Maybe—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "Let's just take things one step at a time." Lucy nodded, understanding that there were complicated feelings and decisions ahead for all of them. But for now, it was enough to know that they weren't alone anymore, that someone cared about what happened to them. "The wagon's ready," David announced, standing up and brushing dirt off his hands. "Who wants to take the first ride in the newly repaired Collins family wagon?" Both children cheered and climbed into the wagon bed, examining all the supplies and toys with fresh excitement. Lucy climbed onto the driver's seat next to David, feeling like she was starting a new chapter of her life. As David guided the horses back onto the trail, Lucy looked back one last time at the place where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. Tomorrow they would start the journey to California and whatever waited for them there. But today they had found each other, and that was enough. The repaired wagon rolled smoothly down the dusty trail as the sun began to paint the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. Lucy sat beside David on the driver's seat, marveling at how different everything felt compared to just a few hours ago. Behind them, Billy and Annie were playing with their new toys, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like music she hadn't heard in months. "We should find a good place to make camp soon," David said, scanning the landscape ahead. "There's a spot about 2 miles up where there's water and shelter from the wind." "You know this area well?" Lucy observed. "I've traveled this route many times over the years. Part of being a sheriff means knowing all the roads and trails in your territory." David glanced at her with a slight smile. "Though I never expected to be traveling it with my brother's family." Lucy found herself studying David's profile as he drove. There was something peaceful about him that she hadn't noticed during their earlier, more intense conversations. Now that the immediate crisis was over and the children were safe, she could see the kind of man he really was beneath the badge and the authority. "David," she said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "You said you don't have children of your own. Have you ever been married?" David was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "I was engaged once, about 5 years ago. Her name was Catherine, and she was the school teacher in town. We had everything planned, the wedding, the house, even picked out names for the children we hoped to have." "What happened?" "She decided she couldn't marry a man whose job put him in danger every day. She said she couldn't spend her life wondering if I'd come home each night." David's voice was matter of fact, but Lucy could hear the old pain underneath. She wasn't wrong. Being married to a sheriff isn't easy on families. Lucy thought about Robert and how she had sometimes worried when he worked late in the fields during dangerous weather, or when he had to deal with wild animals threatening their livestock. But those concerns seem small compared to what a sheriff's wife would face. Do you regret choosing your job over marriage? Sometimes, especially when I see families like yours and realize what I've missed. David looked back at Billy and Annie, who were building something elaborate with their wooden blocks. But I've helped a lot of people over the years. I've made communities safer, reunited lost children with their parents, stopped bad men from hurting good people. That has to count for something. It counts for a lot, Lucy said firmly. Robert always said the world needed people willing to stand between good folks and trouble. Is that really what he said? He did. He used to read about sheriffs and marshals in the newspapers and talk about how brave they were. Lucy smiled at the memory. He was proud of what you did, even if he was too stubborn to admit it. David's hands tightened slightly on the reins. I wish I had known that. I wish we had talked before it was too late. Maybe this is his way of bringing us together, Lucy said. Maybe he's making sure his children know their uncle after all. They reached the camping spot David had mentioned. Just as the sun was setting, it was a small grove of cottonwood trees near a natural spring with rocks arranged in a circle showing that other travelers had used this place before. David helped Lucy and the children down from the wagon while the horses drank from the clear water. This is like a fairy tale place, Annie said, spinning around with her arms outstretched. Can we sleep under the stars? If you want to, David said, though I brought blankets and a tent in case it gets cold. Billy was already gathering sticks for a fire. Papa taught me how to build a proper campfire. Want me to show you, Uncle David? I'd like that very much. Lucy watched as David patiently let Billy demonstrate his fire-building skills, offering gentle suggestions but letting the boy take the lead. It was exactly what Robert would have done, proud of his son's knowledge, but ready to help if needed. As darkness settled around their little camp, they shared a meal of fresh bread, canned beans, and dried fruit from David's supplies. The children ate with the enthusiasm of people who had been truly hungry and now appreciated every bite. Lucy found herself eating more than she had in weeks, her body finally relaxing enough to accept nourishment. Uncle David, Annie said, curled up against his side after dinner, will you tell us a story? What kind of story would you like? A story about Papa when he was little, Billy suggested. We don't know very many stories about him. David looked uncertain. I'm not sure your mama wants to hear old stories tonight. I'd like to hear them. Too, Lucy said quietly. I want to know more about the boy Robert was before I met him. David settled back against a log, with Annie still cuddled against his side and Billy sitting cross-legged nearby. Well, let me think. Did I ever tell you about the time your papa tried to catch a wild horse with nothing but a rope and determination? Both. Children shook their heads eagerly. Robert was about 14, and I was 16. We had heard stories about a beautiful black stallion that roamed the hills near our farm. No one had ever gotten close to him, but your papa was convinced he could tame that horse if he could just catch him. David's voice took on the rhythm of a natural storyteller as he painted pictures of two teenage boys sneaking out before dawn, armed with rope and big dreams. He told them about Robert's patience, how he spent weeks learning the horse's habits, and how he finally managed to get close enough to touch the animal's neck. Did he catch him? Annie asked breathlessly. He did. But when that horse felt the rope, he took off running with your papa hanging on for dear life. I chased after them for 2 miles, certain I was going to have to tell our parents that Robert had been dragged to his death by a wild stallion. What happened? Billy demanded. Your papa held on. That horse ran and bucked and tried everything he could think of to shake Robert loose, but your papa just kept talking to him in that calm voice he had. Eventually, the horse got tired and stopped running. Robert slid down and just stood there, gentling the animal until it trusted him. Did he keep the horse? Annie asked. For 3 years. That horse became the best friend your papa ever had. He named him Thunder, and they went everywhere together. David's voice grew softer. When Robert left home after our fight, he took Thunder with him. I always wondered what happened to that horse. Papa had a horse named Thunder when I was really little, Billy said thoughtfully. He was old and gentle, and Papa said he had been with him since before I was born. Papa cried when Thunder died. David smiled sadly. That would be the same horse. Your papa kept him right to the end. Lucy felt tears in her eyes as she listened to this glimpse into Robert's past. He never told me how he got Thunder. He just said the horse had been a good friend for a long time. That was Robert. He didn't talk much about the past, but he never forgot the things that mattered to him. David looked at the children, who were fighting sleep but didn't want the story to end, just like he never forgot about the family he loved, even when they were far away. As the fire burned lower, David told more stories about their childhood adventures in the woods, mishaps on the farm, and the dreams they had shared before life pulled them in different directions. Lucy found herself learning things about her husband that she had never known, seeing him as the adventurous boy who had grown into the steady man she had married. I wish I could have met Papa when he was little, Annie said sleepily. In a way you did, David told her. Every time you see Billy being brave and determined, that's your Papa when he was young. Every time you use your imagination to turn ordinary things into adventures, that's your Papa's spirit living on in you. Billy yawned widely. Are you going to stay with us forever, Uncle David? I'm going to stay as long as you need me, David promised. And even when I have to go back to work, I'll visit as often as I can. You're my family now, and family takes care of each other. As David helped settle the children into their bedrolls near the warm fire, Lucy realized that something fundamental had shifted in all of them. They weren't just four people traveling together anymore. They were becoming a family, bound together by shared stories, mutual care, and the memory of the man they had all loved. Thank you, she said quietly to David, as they sat watching the children sleep. For what? For giving them back their father's history, for helping them understand where they come from. Lucy looked at the peaceful faces of her children. They needed to know they're part of something bigger than just the three of us. They're part of the Collins family legacy, David said firmly. And that legacy includes being brave, being kind, and taking care of each other no matter what. Robert would be proud of the children you're raising. And he'd be proud of the man his brother became, Lucy replied. You're not the person he fought with all those years ago. You're the person he always hoped you'd grow up to be. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the clear desert sky, each of them thinking about the strange journey that had brought them together and wondering what new adventures tomorrow would bring. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day on the desert trail, and the small town of Riverside, California, had become more of a home than Lucy ever imagined possible. She stood at the window of the general store where she worked, watching the busy street outside and marveling at how much her life had changed since David had first driven his wagon into their desperate situation. The store belonged to Mrs. Henderson, a kind widow who had welcomed Lucy with open arms when David had explained their situation. What had started as temporary work to help Lucy get on her feet had grown into something more meaningful. Lucy had a natural talent for managing inventory and dealing with customers, and Mrs. Henderson had begun talking about making her a partner in the business. Lucy, dear, Mrs. Henderson called from behind the counter, that handsome sheriff of yours is coming up the street again. Lucy smiled at the description. David had extended his stay in California far beyond the few weeks he had originally planned. He had taken a temporary position helping the local sheriff maintain order in Riverside, which was growing rapidly as more families moved west. But everyone in town knew he stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with law enforcement. The bell above the door chimed as David entered, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Billy and Annie rushed to greet him, as they did every day when he finished his rounds and came to walk them home. "Uncle David!" Annie threw herself into his arms. "Guess what happened at school today?" "Tell me everything," David said, lifting her up and settling her on his hip while Billy tugged at his sleeve for attention. Lucy watched the easy affection between David and her children, feeling that familiar warmth in her chest that had grown stronger with each passing day. The children adored their uncle, and he had stepped naturally into the role of father figure they needed. But it was more than duty or obligation that motivated him now. "How was your day?" David asked Lucy as the children ran off to play in the back room where Mrs. Henderson kept toys for young visitors. "Busy. The Johnsons finally decided on fabric for their new curtains, and we got a shipment of those books you ordered from San Francisco." Lucy smoothed her apron and tried to ignore the way her heart sped up whenever David looked at her with that particular expression in his eyes. "The books arrived? That's wonderful. Billy will be so excited to have new stories to read." Over the months, David had made sure the children had access to education and opportunities they never could have afforded before. He had also quietly paid off several debts Lucy hadn't even known Robert had left behind, clearing her name and giving her a fresh start. "David," Lucy said quietly, glancing around to make sure Mrs. Henderson was busy with other customers, "we need to talk about something important." His expression grew serious. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "That's just it." Lucy took a deep breath, gathering courage for something she had been thinking about for weeks. "Everything is going almost too well. You've been here for 6 months, helping us get settled, making sure we have everything we need. But you have a life back in Arizona. You have responsibilities." David leaned against the counter, studying her face. "Are you asking me to leave?" "I'm asking you to be honest with me about what you want. With yourself about what you want." Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because if you're staying out of obligation to Robert's memory, or because you feel guilty about the past, that's not fair to any of us." David was quiet for a long moment, watching Billy and Annie through the doorway as they built an elaborate town out of wooden blocks. "What if I told you I'm staying because I can't imagine my life without you and the children in it?" Lucy felt her breath catch. They had been dancing around this conversation for weeks, both of them aware of the growing feelings between them but uncertain how to address them. "Is that what you're telling me?" she asked. "Lucy, I know this is complicated. I know you loved Robert, and I would never want to replace him or make you feel like you have to choose between honoring his memory and moving forward with your life." David stepped closer, his voice gentle but determined. "But I also know that Robert would want his children to have a father who loves them, and he would want you to be happy." "How can you be so sure about what Robert would want?" "Because I knew my brother. Despite all our differences, I knew his heart. He was generous and loving, and he always wanted the best for the people he cared about." David reached out to touch Lucy's hand gently. He would want his family to be whole again. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside them suddenly, making both Lucy and David step back. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said with a knowing smile, "but there's someone here to see you." "Sheriff Collins." David turned to see a man in a dusty coat standing near the entrance, looking around the store with obvious discomfort. Lucy recognized the look of someone who wasn't used to being in civilized places. "Can I help you?" David asked automatically, shifting into his professional demeanor. "You Sheriff Collins?" the man asked. "I am. Got a message for you from the territorial marshal back in Arizona. Says it's important." David took the sealed envelope the man offered, his expression growing concerned as he read the contents. Lucy watched his face, trying to gauge whether the news was good or bad. "What is it?" she asked when he finished reading. "The county commissioners want me back. There's been trouble with cattle rustlers, and they need someone with experience to handle the situation." David folded the letter carefully. "They're offering me a promotion to district sheriff if I return within 2 weeks. Lucy felt her heart. SINK, a promotion would mean better pay, more prestige, and recognition for David's years of dedicated service. It was everything he had worked toward in his career. "That's wonderful news," she said, trying to sound happy for him, even as she felt like something was breaking inside her chest. "Is it?" David asked quietly, before Lucy could answer. Billy and Annie came running from the back room, having overheard parts of the conversation. "Uncle David, are you leaving us?" Annie asked, her eyes wide with worry. I don't know yet, sweetheart, David said honestly, kneeling down to her level. Some people back in Arizona need my help with a difficult problem. But we need you too, Billy said. His voice small and uncertain. David looked from the children to Lucy, clearly torn between duty and desire. I know you do, and that makes this decision very difficult. Lucy watched the pain in David's face and realized that she couldn't let him make this choice alone. Over the past 6 months, he had sacrificed his career advancement, his comfortable life, and his future prospects to help her family. Now it was her turn to be brave. Children, she said, her voice stronger than she felt, go help Mrs. Henderson arrange the new books on the shelf. Uncle David and I need to finish our grown-up conversation. When they were alone again, Lucy took David's hands in hers. You have to take the promotion, Lucy. No, listen to me. You've spent 6 months putting our needs ahead of your own. You've given up opportunities and postponed your own dreams to help us heal and find our place in the world. I can't let you sacrifice any more for us. What if I don't want to go back without you? The question hung in the air between them, full of possibility and fear. Lucy looked into David's eyes and saw not just affection, but love, deep, committed, lasting. Love. Then ask me to come with you, she said quietly. David's eyes widened. Lucy, are you saying... I'm saying that Robert is gone and I will always love his memory. But I'm still alive, and so are my children. We deserve to have love and happiness and family in our lives. Lucy took a shaky breath. And if you'll have us, we'd like that family to include you. David pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as months of careful restraint finally gave way to honest emotion. Lucy Collins, he whispered against her hair, will you marry me? Will you let me be a real father to Billy and Annie? Will you help me build a life that honors Robert's memory while creating something new and beautiful for all of us? Yes, Lucy said, tears streaming down her face, yes to all of it. The sound of children cheering made them look up to see Billy and Annie peeking around the corner, grins spreading across their faces. Does this mean Uncle David is going to be our new papa? Annie asked. If that's what you want, David said, opening his arms to include the children in their embrace. We want it, Billy said firmly. We want to be a real family. As Lucy stood surrounded by the 3 people who had become her whole world, she thought about the strange journey that had brought them together. She had tried to rob a stranger on a desert road, only to discover he was the brother her husband had lost and the father her children needed. Sometimes the most desperate moments led to the most beautiful destinations. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a bottle of celebratory cider and glasses for everyone. I think this calls for a toast, she said with tears in her own eyes. To new beginnings, David said, raising his glass. To family, Lucy added. To love that finds a way, Mrs. Henderson contributed. And Billy, with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children, offered the final toast to Papa Robert, who sent us Uncle David when we needed him most, as they drank their cider and began making plans for their future together. Lucy knew that Robert would indeed be proud. His children would grow up knowing they were loved,